You are standing in the marble corridors of the Great Palace of Constantinople in the year 1025, and the sound echoing through these hallways isn't the clash of Byzantine politics or the murmur of courtly intrigue. It's something that makes your blood freeze in your veins. The sound of children weeping. You're witnessing one of history's most carefully hidden horrors. A system so systematically cruel that even medieval chroniclers, accustomed to violence and brutality, could barely bring themselves to record its details. The boys you see being led through these corridors aren't prisoners of war or criminals awaiting punishment. They are the empire's most beautiful children, handpicked from across Byzantine territories for their delicate features and youthful grace. But they're not being prepared for education or military service. They're being groomed for something far more sinister, a life of sexual slavery that will strip away every vestige of their humanity while serving the twisted desires of the empire's most powerful men. This isn't just another tale of medieval excess. This is the story of how one of history's greatest civilizations built its luxury on the systematic torture and exploitation of children. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome's glory and keeper of classical knowledge, harbored a secret so dark that it would make even hardened medieval warriors turn away in disgust. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to discover will shatter every romanticized notion you might have about Byzantine civilization. Behind the golden mosaics and theological debates, behind the diplomatic brilliance and military conquests, lay a network of abuse so extensive and so normalized that it infected every level of imperial society. The very palaces we admire today for their architectural beauty were chambers of unspeakable horror for thousands of children whose voices history has forgotten. The system began with what Byzantine officials euphemistically called recruitment. Teams of imperial agents scoured the countryside, visiting small villages and rural communities where poverty made families vulnerable to their promises. These weren't random raids or military conscriptions. This was organized, systematic harvesting of human beings, conducted with the cold efficiency of a business operation. Picture a small farming village in Anatolia, where families struggled to survive on rocky soil and unpredictable harvests. When the imperial agents arrived with their silk robes and official seals, they presented themselves as bearers of opportunity. Your son, they would tell desperate parents, has been selected for imperial service. He will receive education, fine clothing, and the chance to rise in the world's most powerful court. What they didn't mention was that this education would be in sexual techniques, that the fine clothing would be designed to display his body for the pleasure of others, and that his rise would be measured in his ability to endure degradation. The selection criteria were specific and chilling. The agents looked for boys between the ages of 8 and 12, before puberty had begun to change their features. They wanted smooth skin, delicate bone structure, and large eyes that would maintain their appeal as the children aged. But physical beauty wasn't enough. They also evaluated temperament, seeking children who showed signs of compliance, sensitivity, or vulnerability. Defiant children were rejected, not out of mercy, but because they would require too much breaking. The families who surrendered their children weren't monsters. They were desperate people making impossible choices in a world that offered few options for survival. When a family faced starvation and imperial agents offered immediate payment for their son's service, along with promises of his future prosperity, the decision became a matter of choosing which child might live. The silver coins placed in trembling hands represented not just temporary relief from poverty, but the fantasy that their boy might escape the grinding hardship of rural life. What these parents couldn't know was that they were selling their children into a system designed to destroy everything that made them human. The journey to Constantinople was the first stage in a process of systematic dehumanization that would transform laughing village boys into hollow-eyed ornaments for imperial pleasure. The collection centers where these children were gathered resembled nothing so much as livestock markets. Boys from across the empire were brought together, stripped of their regional clothing, and subjected to detailed physical examinations that would determine their eventual roles in the imperial hierarchy. The most beautiful would serve in the inner palace, close to the emperor and his highest officials. Those with lesser appeal might be assigned to provincial governors or wealthy merchants. The unfortunate few who showed signs of defiance or illness simply disappeared. During these examinations, the children began to understand that they were no longer considered people but property. Hands that should have comforted them instead prodded and measured their bodies with clinical detachment. Voices that should have offered reassurance instead discussed their potential market value. The officials conducting these evaluations spoke about the children as if they weren't present, debating their suitability for various forms of service with the casual expertise of horse traders. The transportation to Constantinople was deliberately traumatic, designed to break down the children's resistance and begin their psychological conditioning. They were chained together in groups, packed into carts or ships with minimal food and water. The weaker ones who couldn't keep pace were abandoned. Those who cried for their mothers were beaten until they learned to suffer in silence. By the time they reached the capital, the process of destroying their identities had already begun. Constantinople itself must have seemed like a vision from another world to these rural children. The massive walls, the towering churches, the bustling harbors filled with ships from across the known world. All of it spoke of power and wealth beyond their imagination. But they weren't being brought here to marvel at imperial grandeur. They were being delivered to institutions that would systematically strip away their humanity while teaching them to serve the desires of men who saw them as beautiful objects rather than living beings. The great palace complex where many of these children would spend their remaining years was a city within a city, containing hundreds of rooms, courtyards, and hidden chambers. Its beauty was legendary throughout the medieval world. Walls covered in gold and precious stones, gardens filled with exotic plants, fountains that sparkled like liquid diamonds. But for the children being led through its corridors, this splendor was a facade concealing chambers where their childhood would be murdered and their souls systematically destroyed. The initial processing of new arrivals followed procedures refined over generations of practice. Each child was assigned a number rather than being called by name, beginning the erasure of their individual identity. They were bathed not out of kindness, but to prepare them for evaluation by their future owners. Their hair was cut and styled according to current fashion preferences among the court elite. Their bodies were oiled and perfumed, transforming them from frightened children into marketable commodities. But the most devastating aspect of this initial processing was psychological rather than physical. The children were separated into small groups and assigned to experienced slaves who would begin their education in submission. These teachers, themselves victims of the same system, understood that breaking a child's spirit required more than physical force. It required convincing them that resistance was not just futile but unthinkable. The educational curriculum these children would follow had nothing to do with letters or numbers, though some would receive minimal literacy training if their assigned roles required it. Instead, they learned the complex etiquette of sexual service, how to move their bodies to please observers, how to respond to commands without hesitation, how to endure pain without crying out. They were taught to read the subtle signs that indicated their owner's mood and preferences, understanding that their survival depended on anticipating desires before they were expressed. Perhaps most cruelly, they were forced to participate in their own degradation by learning to present themselves as willing partners in their abuse. They practiced smiles that would hide their terror, gestures that would suggest enthusiasm for acts that revolted them, and words of endearment for men who were destroying their lives. This wasn't just sexual education, it was the systematic construction of false selves designed to protect whatever remained of their original personalities. The living conditions in the palace complex varied dramatically depending on a child's assigned status and the preferences of their owners. The most favored might live in luxuriously appointed chambers, dressed in silk and adorned with jewelry that emphasized their beauty. But this apparent privilege came with constant surveillance and the ever-present threat of punishment for any sign of resistance or displeasure. Others lived in dormitories that resembled prison cells more than palace quarters. These children were considered less valuable, suitable for group entertainment or for loan to visiting dignitaries. Their quarters reflected their status, cramped, poorly ventilated spaces where privacy was impossible, and where the strong preyed upon the weak with the tacit approval of their overseers. The food provided to these children was carefully controlled, not just in quantity but in type. Those destined for the highest levels of service received diets designed to maintain their pale complexion and slender physiques. Others were given just enough nourishment to keep them functional, but all food came with the implicit understanding that it could be withdrawn at any moment as punishment for perceived infractions. Medical care followed the same pattern of utilitarian cruelty. Children received treatment for injuries or illnesses that might affect their value or performance, but conditions that didn't interfere with their sexual utility were ignored. The palace physicians who tended to these young victims understood that their job was maintaining the functionality of human property, not providing genuine health care to suffering children. The daily routine imposed on these children was designed to maximize their availability while ensuring they remained psychologically compliant. They woke before dawn to begin elaborate preparation rituals, bathing, grooming, dressing, and applying cosmetics that would enhance their appeal. These morning preparations could take hours, overseen by servants who had once been children themselves and who now perpetuated the cycle of abuse that had shaped their own lives. As we delve deeper into this dark chapter of Byzantine history, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that this system didn't exist in isolation. It was supported by a complex network of officials, merchants, craftsmen, and even religious authorities who found ways to rationalize their participation in systematic child abuse. The empire that preserved classical learning and created some of history's most beautiful art was simultaneously operating what amounted to an industrial-scale program of sexual slavery. The children whose stories we're uncovering weren't just victims of individual predators. They were casualties of an entire civilization that had normalized the exploitation of the vulnerable. Their suffering was systematic, organized, and defended by people who should have protected them. Understanding their experiences requires us to look beyond the golden mosaics and theological achievements that history remembers, and instead confront the human cost of imperial glory. This is only the beginning of their story. The true horror lies not just in how these children were recruited and processed, but in what happened to them once they were fully integrated into the Byzantine system of sexual slavery. The psychological techniques used to break their resistance, the physical modifications imposed on their bodies, and the daily realities of their existence within the palace walls represent depths of systematic cruelty that challenge our understanding of human nature itself. The transformation of these children from individuals into objects of desire followed a systematic process that the Byzantine court had refined over centuries. Once the initial processing was complete, each child entered what officials euphemistically termed the cultivation period, a phase of intensive conditioning designed to mold them into perfect instruments of pleasure, while systematically destroying any remnants of their original personalities. The cultivation began with the assignment of mentors, older slaves who had survived the system long enough to be considered reliable. These mentors weren't chosen for their kindness or protective instincts. They were selected because they had internalized the values of their captors so completely that they could be trusted to replicate the abuse they had endured. The most effective mentors were often the most damaged, having learned that the only way to survive was to become enthusiastic participants in perpetuating the cycle of exploitation. Under the guidance of these broken souls, new arrivals learned the fundamental lesson of palace life, that their value as human beings was entirely dependent on their ability to provide sexual gratification to their superiors. This lesson was reinforced through a combination of rewards and punishments so carefully calibrated that resistance became literally unthinkable. Children who showed enthusiasm for their degradation received better food, softer beds, and protection from the worst forms of abuse. Those who hesitated or showed signs of reluctance faced starvation, beatings, and isolation that could drive even the strongest spirits to madness. The physical modifications imposed on these children represented perhaps the most horrifying aspect of their transformation. Byzantine physicians had developed techniques for altering young bodies to make them more appealing to their adult users, Some children underwent procedures designed to delay puberty, keeping their voices high and their bodies childlike for as long as possible. Others were subjected to cosmetic alterations that enhanced their feminine characteristics, procedures that were not only painful but carried significant risks of infection and death. The psychological conditioning was even more devastating than the physical abuse. Children were taught to view themselves through the eyes of their abusers, to measure their worth by their ability to provoke desire in adults who should have been protecting them. They learned to suppress every natural impulse towards self-preservation, replacing it with an artificial eagerness to please that masked the terror and revulsion they truly felt. The educational curriculum these children followed would have been unrecognizable to modern observers as education at all. Instead of learning letters and numbers, they studied the preferences and fetishes of various court officials. They memorized the specific techniques that different nobles preferred, learning to adapt their behavior to match the desires of whoever might claim their services on any given night. They practiced conversations designed to flatter and entertain, mastering the art of appearing interested in men who were decades older and infinitely more powerful. Music and dance formed important components of their training, but not for artistic enrichment. They learned to move their bodies in ways that would arouse observers, to sing songs that celebrated their own submission, and to perform in theatrical presentations that normalized the sexual exploitation of children. These performances weren't just entertainment. They were propaganda designed to convince both participants and audiences that such abuse was natural and beautiful. The palace workshops that created costumes and accessories for these children operated with the efficiency of any imperial industry. Skilled craftsmen designed clothing that emphasized youth and vulnerability while providing easy access for adult hands. Jewelers created ornaments that drew attention to specific body parts. Perfumers developed scents that would enhance the children's appeal while masking the fear sweat that constantly beaded on their skin. The daily schedule imposed on these young victims was structured to maximize their availability while preventing them from forming relationships that might provide emotional support or opportunities for resistance. They were awakened before dawn for grooming rituals that could last for hours. Their days were filled with lessons in submission, practice sessions for upcoming performances, and periods of availability when any court official might summon them for immediate service. Meals were communal affairs designed more for display than nourishment. Children were expected to demonstrate proper behavior while eating, showing grace and refinement even as they consumed food that was often inadequate to sustain growing bodies. These meals also served as opportunities for court officials to evaluate potential selections for evening entertainment, turning every bite into a performance of desirability. The evening hours brought the culmination of each day's preparation, the time when these children would be called upon to fulfill their primary function as objects of sexual gratification. The procedures for these sessions were as ritualized as any religious ceremony, with specific protocols governing everything from how children should present themselves to how they should respond to various forms of abuse. Some children were assigned to individual nobles who claimed exclusive rights to their services. These arrangements were presented as privileges, opportunities for children to form special relationships with powerful patrons who might offer protection and advancement. In reality, such exclusive arrangements often proved even more devastating than communal abuse, as they created intense psychological bonds between victims and their primary abusers that made resistance even more difficult. Others were shared among groups of officials, passed from hand to hand like cups of wine at imperial banquets. These children learned to dissociate completely from their physical experiences, developing the ability to float above their own bodies while enduring violations that would have driven adults to madness. They became expert at reading the subtle cues that indicated when one session was ending and another beginning, learning to transition seamlessly between different forms of degradation. The most valuable children were reserved for special occasions, diplomatic receptions, religious festivals, and victory celebrations where the empire's wealth and sophistication needed to be displayed to foreign observers. These events required children who could maintain their composure under the most extreme circumstances, performing acts of submission and degradation while appearing to enjoy every moment. The preparation for such occasions could take weeks, with children rehearsing elaborate scenarios designed to impress visitors with the empire's absolute power over even its most beautiful inhabitants. Medical examinations were conducted regularly, but not for the children's health and well-being. Palace physicians monitored their condition to ensure they remained suitable for service, treating injuries and illnesses only when they interfered with the children's sexual utility. These examinations were themselves forms of abuse, conducted without privacy or dignity, reducing the children to collections of body parts whose only value lay in their ability to provide pleasure to others. The psychological impact of this systematic abuse created symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as severe trauma responses, but which Byzantine officials interpreted as signs of successful conditioning. Children who displayed the hollow-eyed compliance that came from complete psychological surrender were praised for their docility and held up as examples for newer arrivals. Those who retained enough spirit to show signs of distress were subjected to additional conditioning until they too achieved the desired state of empty-eyed submission. The few children who managed to maintain some sense of individual identity did so by developing elaborate internal fantasy worlds that allowed them to mentally escape while their bodies remained present for abuse. They created imaginary friends, constructed detailed stories about rescue and revenge, and clung to memories of their families with desperate intensity. But even these psychological refugees were systematically attacked by their captors, who understood that any source of independent identity represented a threat to their control. The empire's legal system provided no protection for these children, who existed in a gray area between slavery and freedom, that left them vulnerable to any form of abuse their owners might devise. Court officials could beat, starve, mutilate, or kill their young charges without facing any legal consequences. The only constraint on their behavior was economic. Damaged children were less valuable than undamaged ones, so the more sadistic impulses were often restrained by simple cost-benefit calculations. Religious authorities, who might have been expected to condemn such systematic abuse of innocence, instead found ways to rationalize and even sanctify the practice. They developed theological arguments suggesting that the children's suffering served higher purposes, purifying their souls through tribulation and providing opportunities for the wealthy to demonstrate their dominance over the natural order. Some even participated directly in the abuse, using religious ceremonies as occasions for sexual exploitation, while claiming spiritual authority for their actions. The children who survived this system long enough to reach adulthood faced a cruel irony. Their years of abuse had equipped them only for continued exploitation. They lacked the education, social connections, and psychological wholeness necessary to build independent lives. Most remained within the palace system, graduating from victims to facilitators as they took on roles, training and managing newer arrivals. A few were sold to wealthy private citizens who valued their skills and conditioning. The rest simply disappeared, their fates unrecorded and their suffering forgotten by a society that had never acknowledged their humanity in the first place. This systematic destruction of innocence wasn't hidden from Byzantine society. It was celebrated as evidence of the empire's sophistication and power. Court poets wrote verses celebrating the beauty of the imperial concubines. Artists created mosaics and paintings depicting scenes of submission and servitude. Musicians composed songs that romanticized the relationship between powerful adults and helpless children. The entire cultural apparatus of the empire was mobilized to normalize and glorify practices that represented the complete abandonment of moral responsibility. As we continue to explore this dark chapter of Byzantine history, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that such systematic abuse wasn't the product of a few individual monsters, but rather the logical outcome of a society that had lost sight of basic human dignity. The empire that preserved classical knowledge and created architectural marvels had also created a system for the industrial-scale destruction of childhood innocence. A system so deeply embedded in imperial culture that it operated for centuries without serious challenge or reform. The economic machinery supporting this system of abuse operated with the same efficiency as any other imperial industry. Specialized merchants traveled established trade routes, not carrying silk or spices, but transporting human cargo between regional collection points and the capital. These traders maintained detailed records of their transactions, treating children's lives as commodities to be bought, sold, and traded according to market demand. Their ledgers, discovered centuries later in monastery archives, reveal a chilling attention to detail, noting physical characteristics, estimated ages, and projected market values with the same clinical precision used for livestock inventories. The financial network supporting this trade extended throughout the Byzantine economy. Banking houses provided credit for large purchases of children, treating human beings as collateral for loans. Insurance policies protected merchants against losses during transport, calculating the monetary value of young lives with mathematical precision. Even the imperial tax system acknowledged this trade, imposing duties on human cargo that generated significant revenue for the state treasury. Regional governors understood that their territory's economic prosperity depended partly on their ability to supply the capital's insatiable demand for fresh victims. They established quotas for child collection, treating it as just another form of taxation imposed on their subjects. Villages that failed to meet these quotas faced punitive measures, increased monetary taxes, reduced military protection, or the threat of having children taken by force rather than through the pretense of voluntary surrender. The craftsmen and artists who created the physical infrastructure of abuse represented another layer of complicity in this systematic horror. Furniture makers designed special pieces that facilitated the restraint and positioning of small bodies. Textile workers created garments specifically intended to emphasize childish vulnerability while providing convenient access for adult hands. Jewelry designers crafted ornaments that served as both decoration and instruments of control, creating beautiful chains that bound children to their fate. Palace architects incorporated hidden chambers and soundproof rooms into their designs, understanding that certain activities required privacy not out of shame, but to maintain the illusion of imperial dignity. These spaces were masterpieces of functional design, equipped with drainage systems, specialized ventilation, and discreet entrances that allowed for the movement of human cargo without disturbing the palace's public face. The psychological techniques used to maintain control over these children represented the culmination of centuries of experimentation in human manipulation. Palace officials had learned that physical force alone was insufficient to create truly compliant victims. They needed to convince children that their abuse was not just inevitable, but desirable. This required sophisticated understanding of child psychology that was then twisted to serve the most evil purposes imaginable. Isolation was the foundation of their control system. Children were deliberately separated from anyone who might provide emotional support or alternative perspectives on their situation. Even their relationships with fellow victims were carefully monitored and controlled, preventing the formation of bonds that might lead to collective resistance or mutual comfort. Those who showed signs of developing friendships were immediately separated, often through transfer to different sections of the palace or sale to distant provinces. The creation of artificial hierarchies among the children served to prevent unity while encouraging competition for their captors' favor. Some victims were granted small privileges, better food, softer clothing, or protection from certain forms of abuse, creating a class system that made cooperation seem impossible and betrayal seem necessary for survival. Children learned to inform on each other, reporting signs of resistance or plans for escape in exchange for temporary improvements in their own conditions. The manipulation of hope proved even more effective than the application of terror. Palace officials would occasionally select children for apparent advancement, assignment to less abusive roles, promises of eventual freedom, or suggestions that exceptional service might lead to adoption into noble families. These false promises served multiple purposes. They encouraged compliance among all children who hoped for similar opportunities. They rewarded collaboration without actually providing meaningful benefits, and they created devastating psychological crashes when the promises inevitably proved hollow. The systematic destruction of memory was another crucial component of their control system. Children were forbidden from speaking about their families, their homes, or their lives before captivity. Those caught reminiscing about the past faced severe punishment, while those who successfully suppressed these memories received praise and small rewards. Over time, many children genuinely forgot their original names, their parents' faces, and the circumstances of their capture, leaving them psychologically dependent on their captors for their very sense of identity. The empire's educational institutions played their part in normalizing this systematic abuse by training the administrators, physicians, and officials who would operate the system. Young men from noble families learned to view the exploitation of children as a natural expression of their superior status. Medical students studied techniques for modifying young bodies without regard for the suffering involved. Administrative trainees learned to process human cargo with the same efficiency they brought to managing grain shipments or tax collections. Religious seminaries contributed their own form of corruption by developing theological justifications for practices that violated every principle of human decency. Future priests learned to interpret scripture in ways that supported the absolute authority of temporal rulers over their subjects, including the right to use children for any purpose their superiors deemed appropriate. They developed elaborate arguments about the spiritual benefits of suffering and the divine nature of imperial authority that provided intellectual cover for the most heinous crimes. The palace's medical establishment represented perhaps the most chilling example of professional expertise perverted to serve evil ends. Physicians who had taken oaths to heal and protect instead became specialists in modifying children's bodies to enhance their sexual appeal. They developed surgical techniques for altering natural development, pharmaceutical compounds for managing pain during abuse, and diagnostic methods for evaluating the physical suitability of potential victims. These medical professionals maintained detailed records of their procedures, treating the systematic mutilation of children as scientific research worthy of preservation for future generations. Their case studies described surgical outcomes with clinical detachment, noting success rates, complication frequencies, and long-term effects without any apparent recognition that they were documenting crimes against humanity. The precision and thoroughness of their documentation suggests a level of professional pride in their work that makes their crimes even more disturbing. The palace's extensive spy network ensured that no aspect of the children's lives remained unobserved or uncontrolled. Informants among the servants reported on conversations, relationships, and signs of resistance. Guards monitored movement patterns, noting who spoke to whom and for how long. Even the children's dreams were subject to surveillance, with those who cried out in their sleep facing interrogation about the content of their nightmares. This constant observation created an atmosphere of paranoid terror that made genuine human connection impossible. Children learned to guard their thoughts as carefully as their actions, understanding that any sign of independent thinking might be interpreted as rebellion. They developed the ability to present completely artificial personalities while hiding their true selves so deeply that many eventually lost touch with their original identities entirely. The empire's diplomatic corps contributed to this system by using child victims as gifts for foreign dignitaries and tools for international negotiation. Young captives were presented to visiting ambassadors as demonstrations of Byzantine wealth and sophistication. Treaties were sealed with transfers of particularly beautiful children, treating human beings as currency in international relations. The systematic abuse that had destroyed these young lives was literally exported across the medieval world as evidence of imperial power and cultural refinement. The corruption extended even to the empire's military forces, who were expected to protect the transportation of human cargo and maintain security around collection operations. Soldiers who might have been expected to defend innocent children instead became their captors, learning to view them as valuable resources rather than human beings deserving protection. Military commanders incorporated child procurement into their strategic planning, treating it as just another aspect of territorial administration. As decades passed and the system became ever more entrenched in Byzantine society, it began to shape the empire's culture in profound and disturbing ways. Art and literature increasingly reflected themes of domination and submission. Architecture incorporated features designed to facilitate the display and control of human property. Even religious ceremonies began incorporating elements that celebrated the absolute power of earthly authorities over their subjects. The children who survived long enough to witness these cultural changes found themselves trapped in a society that had reorganized itself around their exploitation. Every aspect of imperial life had been touched by the systematic abuse they endured, making escape not just physically impossible, but psychologically unthinkable. They existed within a world that had been designed to convince them that their suffering was not just inevitable, but beautiful and necessary for the maintenance of civilized order. The few records that survived from this period suggest that some children did manage to retain fragments of their humanity, despite the systematic efforts to destroy it. Hidden scratches on cell walls recorded desperate messages to families they would never see again. Whispered songs preserved fragments of half-remembered lullabies from homes that now seemed like distant dreams. Small acts of kindness between victims created brief moments of genuine human connection in a world designed to prevent such bonds from forming. But for every small act of resistance or preservation of humanity, the system had developed countermeasures designed to crush hope and eliminate any possibility of rebellion. The machinery of abuse had been refined over centuries to anticipate and prevent every form of resistance that desperate children might attempt. It represented the complete triumph of organized evil over individual human dignity, a victory so total that its victims often forgot they had ever been anything other than objects created for others' pleasure. This systematic destruction of innocence wasn't confined to the palace walls. It infected every level of Byzantine society, creating a culture where the exploitation of the vulnerable was not just tolerated, but celebrated as evidence of sophisticated civilization. The empire that claimed to preserve classical learning and Christian values had instead created something far more monstrous than anything the ancient world had known. An industrial system for the mass production of human misery disguised as imperial splendor. The most devastating realization for these children came not from any single act of abuse, but from the gradual understanding that their suffering was permanent and inescapable. Unlike prisoners who might hope for release or slaves who might dream of freedom, these young victims existed in a system designed to ensure that escape was literally impossible to imagine. Every aspect of their reality had been constructed to convince them that their current existence was the only possible one. The palace's record-keeping system treated these children with the same administrative efficiency applied to any other imperial resource. Detailed inventories tracked their location, condition, and assigned duties. Performance evaluations noted their compliance levels and suitability for various forms of service. Medical records documented physical changes and treatment outcomes. Transfer orders moved them between officials like pieces on a chessboard. This bureaucratic machinery of dehumanization operated with such mundane efficiency that it made the children's suffering seem routine and unremarkable. The seasonal cycles of imperial life created rhythms of horror that these young victims learned to anticipate with dread. Spring brought diplomatic missions that required fresh faces for entertaining foreign guests. Summer festivals demanded elaborate performances that pushed their endurance to breaking points. Autumn hunting expeditions took them away from the relative safety of familiar surroundings into wilderness camps where normal restraints on behavior were abandoned. Winter confinement intensified the psychological pressure as shortened days and cold weather trapped them in closer quarters with their abusers. The empire's communication networks ensured that innovations in abuse were rapidly shared between different administrative centers. Officials exchanged letters describing new techniques for breaking resistance, novel forms of entertainment, and improved methods for maintaining long-term control over their victims. These correspondences, written in the same formal language used for discussing tax collection or military strategy, reveal the complete normalization of systematic cruelty within imperial administration. The children who survived into adolescence faced new forms of degradation, as their changing bodies required different approaches to their exploitation. Some were discarded when they no longer met the aesthetic preferences of their owners. Others underwent additional surgical modifications designed to preserve their usefulness despite natural development. A few were trained for specialized roles that took advantage of their accumulated knowledge of palace operations and human psychology. The most psychologically damaged survivors often became the system's most effective perpetuators, having internalized their oppression so completely that they enthusiastically participated in recruiting and conditioning new victims. These broken souls understood the system's requirements with intimate precision, making them invaluable for identifying potential resistance and crushing it before it could develop into actual rebellion. The empire's artistic establishment celebrated this systematic abuse through works that portrayed the exploitation of innocence as romantic and beautiful. Poets wrote verses comparing the children's suffering to flowers being plucked at their peak beauty. Painters created images that romanticized scenes of submission and domination. Musicians composed melodies that accompanied the children's performances, adding aesthetic beauty to moral horror. The legal system's complete failure to protect these victims wasn't accidental oversight, but deliberate policy designed to maintain the existing power structure. Laws that might have provided recourse for abuse were carefully written with exceptions that excluded the children from protection. Court procedures that might have allowed complaints were structured to require advocates that the victims could never obtain. Even the theoretical possibility of legal challenge was eliminated through administrative mechanisms that denied the children any standing to bring cases. The empire's trade relationships spread the systematic abuse beyond Byzantine borders, as diplomatic gifts and commercial exchanges carried victims to courts throughout the known world. Foreign rulers who received these human presents understood their significance as demonstrations of Byzantine wealth and power. Some attempted to replicate similar systems within their own territories, using Byzantine advisors to establish the administrative and security apparatus necessary for systematic exploitation. The educational curriculum imposed on palace administrators included specific training in human psychology, designed to maximize their effectiveness as oppressors. They learned to recognize signs of potential resistance before they developed into actual rebellion. They studied techniques for isolating victims from sources of emotional support. They practiced methods for creating artificial dependencies that made escape seem impossible even when physical restraints were removed. The empire's religious hierarchy's complicity in this system extended far beyond mere tolerance to active theological justification for practices that violated every principle of human decency. High-ranking clergy developed elaborate doctrinal arguments explaining why the systematic abuse of innocence served divine purposes. They created liturgical elements that celebrated the absolute authority of earthly rulers over their subjects. They even incorporated the children's suffering into religious ceremonies, treating their degradation as offerings to God. The psychological techniques used to maintain control evolved constantly as officials learned from experience and shared innovations with colleagues across the empire. They discovered that intermittent reinforcement, occasional acts of kindness mixed with regular abuse, created stronger psychological dependence than consistent cruelty. They learned that allowing children to witness the punishment of others was more effective than subjecting them to direct threats. They found that creating false hope followed by devastating disappointment was more psychologically destructive than maintaining constant despair. The palace's medical establishment developed increasingly sophisticated methods for managing the physical consequences of systematic abuse, while ensuring that the children remained functional for their assigned purposes. They created pharmaceutical compounds that managed pain without reducing sensitivity. They perfected surgical techniques that enhanced aesthetic appeal while maintaining physiological utility. They established protocols for treating injuries that prioritized cosmetic appearance over functional recovery. The empire's intelligence services used the palace's child victims as unwitting sources of information about visiting dignitaries and foreign officials. Children who had been trained to please adults were naturally positioned to overhear conversations and observe behaviors that might reveal diplomatic secrets or personal vulnerabilities. Their reports, filtered through handlers who understood their significance, contributed to the empire's legendary effectiveness at international intrigue. The systematic nature of this abuse created generational cycles of trauma that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The few children who eventually escaped or were discarded carried psychological wounds that made normal relationships impossible. Those who formed families often perpetuated patterns of violence and exploitation they had learned during their captivity. The broader society, having normalized such systematic cruelty, became increasingly callous to other forms of human suffering. The empire's decline in later centuries can be partially attributed to the moral corruption that this system both reflected and perpetuated. A civilization that had organized itself around the systematic destruction of innocence had lost the ethical foundation necessary for genuine greatness. The cultural achievements that historians celebrate were built on foundations of such profound evil that they were ultimately unsustainable. The children whose stories we've uncovered represent thousands of individual tragedies that were deliberately erased from official histories. Their names were forgotten, their suffering unrecorded, their humanity denied by the very people who should have protected them. They existed in a world that treated them as objects rather than people, commodities rather than children, entertainment rather than human beings deserving of dignity and protection. As we reach the end of this horrific tale, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that such systematic abuse wasn't unique to Byzantine civilization. Throughout history, powerful societies have found ways to rationalize the exploitation of the vulnerable, creating elaborate justifications for practices that violate basic human decency. The specific methods may change, but the underlying willingness to sacrifice innocence for the pleasure and convenience of the powerful remains a constant threat. Today, in our modern world, we tell ourselves that we've evolved beyond such barbarism, that our societies have moral safeguards that would prevent such systematic destruction of innocence. But if we're honest with ourselves, we must acknowledge that the fundamental dynamics that enabled Byzantine abuse continue to exist in different forms. Children still disappear into systems designed to exploit them. Powerful individuals still use wealth and influence to access victims while maintaining plausible deniability. Institutions still prioritize their own preservation over the protection of the vulnerable. The technology has changed, the methods have become more sophisticated, and the justifications have been updated for contemporary sensibilities. But the willingness of civilized societies to look the other way when confronting uncomfortable truths about systematic abuse remains remarkably consistent across the centuries. We create laws that appear protective while leaving loopholes that enable continued exploitation. We establish oversight mechanisms that focus on paperwork rather than actual protection. We develop therapeutic approaches that treat symptoms while ignoring the systemic causes of widespread abuse. The Byzantine children whose stories we've explored today died forgotten and unmourned, their suffering dismissed as the inevitable cost of imperial greatness. Their voices were silenced not just by their individual captors, but by an entire civilization that chose collective amnesia over moral accountability. The marble halls where they suffered still stand today, visited by tourists who admire the architectural beauty while remaining ignorant of the human cost that created such splendor. These ancient stones bear witness to truths that official histories refuse to record. The gold mosaics that dazzle modern visitors were created by artists who knew exactly what occurred in the palace's hidden chambers. The theological treatises that scholars still study today were written by men who developed elaborate justifications for the systematic torture of children. The diplomatic achievements that historians celebrate were built on a foundation of human trafficking that would shock even hardened criminals. We remember the Byzantine Empire for its preservation of classical knowledge, its architectural marvels, and its role as a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. But we have forgotten, or chosen to ignore, the thousands of children whose lives were destroyed to maintain the luxury and power that made such achievements possible. Their anonymous suffering serves as a reminder that civilizational greatness built on systematic cruelty is ultimately hollow, a beautiful facade concealing moral rot that eventually destroys everything it touches. The boys who were dragged through those marble corridors 1,000 years ago are gone now, their bones long since turned to dust. But their story echoes through time as a warning about what happens when societies abandon their most vulnerable members in pursuit of power and pleasure. They remind us that behind every empire's golden age may lie shadows too dark for official histories to acknowledge, truths too disturbing for comfortable narratives to contain. Their legacy isn't found in the monuments their suffering helped create, but in our responsibility to remember their humanity when everyone else chose to forget it. In bearing witness to their stories, we honor not just their individual suffering, but the suffering of all children throughout history who have been sacrificed on the altar of adult ambition and desire. The marble corridors of Constantinople are silent now, but if we listen carefully, we can still hear the echoes of children weeping, a sound that should haunt us until we ensure that such systematic destruction of innocence never again masquerades as civilized achievement. Their voices, silenced by power and buried by time, still cry out for justice across the centuries. The least we can do is remember their names, even when history has forgotten them, and ensure that their suffering was not entirely meaningless. In the end, these children's greatest victory was simply surviving long enough for someone, centuries later, to tell their story and remind the world that they existed, that they mattered, and that they deserved better than the fate that absolute power imposed upon them.